go over every detail except to end by saying she has a bachelor's degree in sociology and a master's degrees in political science and magazine journalism from the University of Oregon. And Adrienne, as I turn it to you, I'll let you introduce the Western State Center yourself. Thank you, Adrienne.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Linda. It is really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. And my hope is that we can be somewhat informal since this is a small group and a working group. I have lots of information to share with you, but I also want you to feel like you can make this a two-way conversation. So I'll present some slides, but I'll also keep an eye out for if someone wants to use a reaction to raise hands or put questions in the chat, we can certainly make this a dialogue. So I met Kauser through the Confronting White Nationalism in Schools Toolkit Train the Trainer workshops, which is a bit of a mouthful. I guess now it would be almost 2 years ago. And
right.
It was 2020, is that right?
Yeah, 2020, right.
2020, okay. And so the beauty of that experience is that the toolkit had been around since 2019, I believe 2018, 2019. And Western State Center decided, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that organization in a moment, but I think this origin story might be interesting to you as folks embarking on this work, that developing kind of a cascading implementation model or a train the trainer model was really going to be the most effective way to get the work out there, because Western State Center is a very lean staff. They're very mighty. They definitely punch above their weight, but there was no way that they could really meaningfully impact hundreds of thousands of students and educators without creating a large network of knowledgeable folks who were really oriented toward democracy building, who really understood the origins of the kinds of white nationalist organizing that we were hearing about from educators across the country. So we brought together folks from all over the United States and several Canadians. We're very happy to see Canada represented in these trainings, and did a series of 3 Train the Trainer events that has resulted in over 150 folks who have received about 9 hours of professional development and have been given their marching orders to go out and spread the word of the toolkit in whatever capacity they can within their sphere of influence. And what I really like about that model is that it, in many ways, breaks down some of the preconceived notions that we sometimes labor under, I know I did, about whose work this is, who should be doing this work. And so we have kindergarten teachers, we have school counselors, we have bus drivers, we have people who work in the front office, we have administrators, we have folks who are leaders in teachers unions, we have folks representing higher ed. We really have a fantastic crew of very dedicated folks who understand that this is really everyone's job, right? There is no one person or one type of person who is responsible for confronting white nationalism or other anti-democracy organizing. This is anyone who has influence or relationships with young people is in a position to do this work. So I just wanted to kind of provide that background and that context of how we came to meet and know one another. And, I'll share with you just a little bit about Western State Center, and I have some slides, but I'll wait and show you those, a little bit later. So we don't all get slide blind, but Western State Center, as I mentioned, is a small nonprofit organization. It's based in the Pacific Northwest of the US and works in what we call the Pacific Northwest and Mountain States. So Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana are the main places where we have folks on the ground. However, it really does work nationally, and as I mentioned, internationally. So we have people who have been trained in Western State Center materials all over North America. And the mission is to build a future where all people can live, love, worship, and work free from bigotry and fear. And Western State Center does this by building capacity within institutions. That's a really important part of their framework and model. So, and this is all done through the intersectional prism of race, gender, and equity. So they really focus, and I should say we work within communities to build and strengthen those communities from the inside, because we know that community context is very important. Western State Center does a lot to promote movement building. So a lot of organizing training, a lot of just giving folks the tools that they need to really bring coalitions together and create narrative shift and get the word out about their work, leadership development, culture shift, and as I mentioned, defending democracy, which I don't think I have to convince anyone on this call feels more tenuous by the day. So that's really the kind of the big picture of Western State Center and the work that I'm going to share with you today. As far as the origin of the toolkit, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, but does anyone have any questions about what Western State Center is, what we do, or sort of the larger context of this work that I can answer before I kind of dive into the content?
Adrienne, I have a question. Having just lived through this experience with our committee, our group, what prompted your organization? What got it started? Was there some impetus or some event? How did it come to be?
Western State Center itself or the toolkit?
Maybe briefly on the first, but the toolkit especially.
Oh, interesting. So I think there was another organization based in Chicago that called the Center for New Community, and my understanding is that a number of folks who kind of left Chicago and moved to the Pacific Northwest were interested in doing kind of similar types of democracy building work in the Pacific Northwest, and essentially took the organizing skills that they had learned and started putting that to use very locally, specifically in response to white nationalist organizing in Oregon and Washington, which is still unfortunately a kind of a hotbed for that kind of activity. And then it really has grown substantially from there, from being starting out as really a capacity building organization to one that has a much broader footprint and is really emerging as a national leader. Our current executive director, Eric Ward, is also a really compelling speaker. If you haven't seen any of his presentations, he's really worth looking up on YouTube. Eric K. Ward. He does a great job of framing a lot of the information that I'm going to share with you today in the school context, framing it more in the broader context. Okay. All right. So what I think I'm going to do today is a little bit of a hybrid of the presentations that I normally do. So what I planned is to walk you through how I typically train people on the toolkit, but I'm going to do it in a little bit of a meta way where I'm going to talk about hit the high points of the toolkit training, but I also want to share with you my experience and our team's experience with how people absorb this information and what questions they typically have and what has really emerged as, I would say, kind of a parallel set of needs that go along with the toolkit in terms of the kind of support that people need to actually implement the material. So that's going to include some lessons learned, and just, again, we talk a lot about, how we communicate about this information in a way that really helps people believe that they are capable of making a difference. I think that is a really key part of being effective in this work. So, so I'm going to kind of give you a double layered presentation here, and let me just get my slide deck pulled up here. Do I have the power to share my screen? I think I do. Oh,
You do
May I-
not. Let
May
me.
I have the power?
Yes, I will do that for you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, you should be good now.
Okay. Let's see here. Okay, great. Can you see the slide that says what is white nationalism?
Yes. we
Okay,
can.
great.
Yeah,
So
Adrian, may I ask a question, Adrian? Will you be able
Sure.
to share the slide deck, which will help Connie, our note taker, not to have to take copious notes?
absolutely. And I'm also happy to share my speaker notes as well, if that's helpful.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah,
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that we tend to talk about very early on in the toolkit presentation, after we really share a little bit about, what the toolkit is and who is it for, as I just did. And that is that Western State Center is a bit unique in our orientation in that we draw a distinction between the way that we talk about white nationalism and the way that we talk about white supremacy. And I understand that this may be a little bit different in the Canadian context. And that's true of a couple of different points that I'm going to make in this presentation. And I'll try to name that when it comes up. But the reason for that is because, obviously white supremacy is really the smog that we all breathe, the water that we all swim in, particularly in a US context with the history of Native genocide and chattel slavery, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, having shaped our cultural and social and legal and financial and medical institutions to the degree that they have. It's very, very important to us that we are not somehow implying that only neo-Nazis or only Proud Boys are engaged in white supremacy thinking, right? So that is just a distinction that we always hit right off the bat. Another reason that we do that is that white nationalism is a distinct social movement that with the goals of building power. And that I think is an important part of the way that we frame this topic as well, because we really want to emphasize that it's not necessarily the goal of these groups for everyone to hate people who aren't white, or hate people who are trans, or hate women, or hate immigrants. That is, of course, the content of the belief system that they are espousing, but the ultimate goal is to build power, is to create a white ethno-state, right? So that power building orientation is, I think, really an important important part of that distinction that we talk about. So white nationalism in the US emerged in the last 5 decades as a direct repudiation of the civil rights era, and really as a sign that the folks who believe in separation of the races, who believe in the legal dominance of white Christians, could not accept that the successes of the civil rights movement, they couldn't really accept that as a loss. They couldn't accept that it was the result of decades and decades and decades of organizing and persistence on the part of African Americans. They really viewed this as this genocide that was happening against whiteness, and that they really believed that the Jewish people fundamentally were behind it. And so that's where the connection between anti-Semitism and white nationalism is so strong, is really in this this lack of ability to believe that African Americans could have achieved that kind of political power on their own. So I think that's another important thing, and one thing I'll mention that people sometimes really have a hard time wrapping their minds around, why white nationalists are so anti-Semitic. And that is not the whole reason why, but that is definitely part of why in the modern white nationalist movement, you see a lot of scapegoating and a lot of rationalizing that the gains that are being made by traditionally marginalized communities on their own behalf could not possibly have happened unless there was some sort of secret cabal of essentially Jewish puppet masters behind the scene making this all happen, right? And that is, if anyone is wading into this, from a sort of a research intelligence gathering point of view, you will see some version of that conspiracy theory repeated over and over and over again. Eric Ward, who I mentioned earlier, talks about the fact that if you want to understand conspiracy theories in their modern form, anti-Semitism is like the Rosetta Stone of conspiracy theories. So that's that's a point that we sometimes will spend a little bit more time on in presentations, because that's sometimes new information for people, particularly if we're not presenting to groups that have a lot of Jewish people in them who are usually very well aware of this conspiracy theory. So white nationalism, as I just mentioned, is built on built largely on this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, seeks to build political power, really does not only trade in racism and anti-Semitism, but misogyny is often referred to as kind of the glue that binds a lot of anti-democracy groups, not just white nationalists, but we're seeing, patriot prayer groups, we're seeing Proud Boys, we're seeing some militant militia groups, et cetera, anti-government groups, et cetera. And so although they may espouse different policy goals or different political goals, you will see a lot of common threads. Misogyny, male supremacism being a huge, huge one. Homophobia and transphobia, which of course are directly related to misogyny, also being, very, very common. And in many ways, kind of, when we talk about recruitment of young people, are some of the first messages that you will see kind of being used as fishing bait, because transphobia and homophobia are so prevalent in many school communities. And as I mentioned, has male supremacist, anti-immigrant, anti-Black, anti-LGBTQ, and anti-Muslim policy goals. So again, just back to that political power building piece.
Quick question: how does indigenous peoples fit into that, respect to Canada and the States? Are they? Could you add that to the list? Or are they off the radar?
Yeah, actually, in a different version of the slide that is on the list. It's supposed to be an older version, but no, you're exactly right. I do think too that context. My understanding is that is. Indigenous people are in some cases kind of lumped in unthinkingly, and in some cases are more explicitly targeted, and that does depend on your location and what kind of cross-cultural communication and contact is common in those locations. But I think in my conversations with the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, they mentioned that that context was a little bit different in Canada. And so that's a little bit out of my area of expertise, but yeah, I definitely am aware that that's the case. So I don't want to belabor this point, because I don't think I need to probably with this group, but like I mentioned, we do talk about drawing the distinction between white supremacy as being a system of oppression rather than a political movement. It can operate on an individual level, but it's also very much a structural dynamic, and that racial animus, and I think this is sort of the linchpin of why we would share this information, is not a necessary factor in perpetuating the system. You can have been conditioned to thinking and operating in a way that upholds white supremacy without having conscious thoughts about, hating people of color, or believing that you are superior to them, or that you should have more fundamental rights than they do. So those things, those distinctions, I think, are important to draw. So that brings us to the toolkit. And the origin story of the toolkit is really came out of an SOS cry that was sent up increasingly by educators in the mid 2010s, I would say, particularly around the lead up to the 2016 Trump election, the 2016 election in which Donald Trump was elected, I should say. And what Western State Center was hearing was that there were a lot of tools available to help schools combat bullying, for example. But this wasn't exactly that. And there were a lot of tools available to help schools promote anti-racism and to promote a more multicultural approach to education, and to help students confront their own biases, et cetera. But this was a little bit different from that too. This kind of fell between the cracks of some existing resources, and teachers, in particular classroom teachers, were saying, I've got kids coming to school who are citing these very extreme views that they are getting from YouTube, that they are hearing in one of the most common places that kids were reporting that they were hearing this rhetoric was in chat rooms related to gaming, online gaming that they were doing, other social media outlets, et cetera, and having a really, really hard time figuring out how to respond without totally shutting down the conversation with this young person. And in some cases, the teachers were saying, I think this is what I'm hearing, but I'm not really sure. I'm seeing these symbols. I don't know what they mean. I don't really have the capacity or the background to have a conversation with the student that I feel like is going to be productive. I feel like I'm just basically saying to them, like, you can't do that, which, educators, their whole success is wrapped up in relationships. So this is often very unsettling to them when they're not quite sure how to leverage that relationship with regard to this content. So, and it's also true, and this is kind of an old quote, and Andrew England has kind of faded from relevance, but it's interesting to me that he's been very, very explicit in saying that the website, The Daily Stormer, was specifically essentially created to capture the imaginations of young people, right? And target them and bring them along ideologically so that they could then also be brought along politically when they became of voting age. And so knowing that essentially educators were feeling like, we know that there are people out there who are competing for the eyes and the brains of these young people. I think largely young white boys and men, but not exclusively anymore. We're seeing this happen more and more young men of color, and even more girls who are being brought into this way of thinking. So we know that they're competing. We need to essentially be actively talking about this and actively in this fight, because otherwise we're just really not doing these kids any service if we're not equipping them with the thinking skills that they need to really understand what they're seeing and hearing. So the toolkit was written by 2 career educators and 1 staff member from Western State Center. It has gone through 1 complete round of revision that was ironically released in January of 2020. And so obviously the cultural context, the political context, has changed significantly, and continues to change very rapidly. We're in the process right now of writing version 3. And I would definitely be open to feedback from all of you as folks who are going to be immersed in looking at the toolkit closely, what, in terms of what you think really should be included in that next edition. So this kind of goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, but one of the things I really try to emphasize when I train on this work is that everyone who engages in the life of a school is in a unique position to push back against We use the term white nationalist. I don't think it's absolutely necessary to use that phrasing. We sometimes, when we're speaking more broadly, we'll say anti-democracy groups, because that's really what they are. We try to stay away from saying far right. Sometimes we'll use the word extremist, but sort of try, because, and for several reasons, some of which I'll go into later, but it's not actually true that some of these groups are functioning only on the fringes anymore. I mean, we see when Trump was in office, there were people with explicitly white nationalist agendas in the White House. So that's why we sort of try not to talk about this as being sort of too far to the right or too fringe or too extreme, because it's quite mainstream, unfortunately. And so that's something that we emphasize when we talk about this as well. So the job here is to really inoculate schools and communities, to strengthen the institution, to strengthen that democracy building lens, so that schools become places, or remain places, ideally, where students can grow and be engaged members of a diverse democracy. So two of the sections of the toolkit that I just wanted to draw your attention to, proactive steps and best practices. And this is, it's an unfortunate reality. Schools are often very overwhelmed. They have a lot of demands placed on them. It makes sense that they, I work for a nonprofit. I totally understand being in like response and reaction mode. That's a familiar MO for me. However, whenever possible, we really try to encourage administrators, counselors, anyone who has their some control over the way that policies are written, the way that agendas are set, the way that professional development is scheduled, to talk about these issues and these kinds of incidents before they happen, right? So before someone carves a swastika into a bench in the lobby of the school, or before someone harasses another student, or before someone cites a white nationalist in their English paper, how are the values of the school being communicated? What policies are in place for how to respond to these incidents? Because we, of course, don't want under response, right? Because that just reinforces the idea that the school doesn't think that those kinds of incidents are a problem. But you don't want to over respond, right? Because then you can end up alienating a young person who really needs support. You can end up kind of skipping some steps of intervention ahead and engaging law enforcement when that wouldn't have been necessary and could actually make the situation worse. So there really is a lot of value in talking through incidents, the types of incidents that could occur before they occur, and making informed choices about the best way to collectively respond to those kinds of incidents when they happen. So I'm going to reference that a little bit more later in the toolkit as well. So these two sections, very popular, very often cited as being some of the most actionable and most important sections that people find themselves coming back to over and over again. So another thing that is not in the toolkit as much, you'll see it sprinkled in there throughout, but one thing that I really think is very important is the idea of communicating the school's shared values. And I'll tell you why. Before I worked for Western State Center, excuse me, I worked for the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I ran the editorial department for what was then called Teaching Tolerance and is now called Learning for Justice. And that was a school-facing sub-program that really focused on anti-bias, anti-racist education. And we were hearing a lot of consternation from educators in the months leading up to the 2016 election. And so we did about essentially how bullying and targeting and identity-based targeting in particular was like through the roof in schools during that period of time, because the essentially incivility was in the zeitgeist in a way that it really had not been previously. And so we did a series of surveys and we wrote a couple of reports and about essentially what schools had been doing to communicate their values and to set agendas and how they talked about friendship and community, et cetera, within the context of the school, and also what happened when these incidents occurred, how long it would take them to recover, et cetera, et cetera. So we just gathered a lot of data over a period of time. And a very, very strong finding that came out of that series of reports is that schools that clearly communicated their values across a variety of channels, so this might be talking about the school's values at pep rallies, having them explicitly named on the website, having them be part of the messaging that might go home in letters to parents, that might be part of any disciplinary discussion, might be posted in the hallway. So this is clear and broadly understood, right? Those schools had it's not that incidents didn't happen there, but they were in a much, much better position to respond to those incidents in ways that the staff felt was actually useful and helpful and resolved what had happened, and that the school climate and school culture was able to recover much more quickly after the incident occurred. Okay, so that's a big part of the reason why I think this is an important but sometimes overlooked aspect of this work. And I understand why too, because it can be very challenging to change culture, and it's harder to give someone a list of steps because it's contextual, like what one school might need to do to emphasize the value of like friendship and community might look different in a different school. So, but I do think it's really important. And I think one of the activities that has really sparked a lot of, this is where I'm gonna do the meta-analysis that has really been very popular when I present on this topic, is asking educators to say, what are the characteristics of a school community where everyone feels safe and valued? And ask them to say, well, what does this sound like? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What is the evidence that you see? And this is this is a nice thing. I like to do this at the end of a training because it really does kind of invite people to bring their imaginations to this, to talk about experiences that they've had, and to get really concrete about how they do this in their context, which really facilitates some nice learning across the group. So that's just one thing that I wanted to mention. I think this is a really, really valuable question to ask, and educators often have extremely insightful things to say about it. Okay, so I just want to make sure I'm not running too long here. Oops, let's go back. Another really popular activity is the discussion of the scenarios in the toolkit. And so these are, again, we find ourselves in the position of constantly rewriting these scenarios because what is happening and the kinds of things that educators are seeing changes so frequently. So I think it would be really interesting, I think, for your group and in the discussions that you're having ongoing, to be kind of collecting scenarios that you can use for these kinds of conversations, because these are really, really useful as well. So this particular scenario, student posting a picture of herself with a white power symbol on social media, other students are talking about it, what do you do? So what I often will do in this case is invite people to get into breakout rooms and go through a different, give them like 5 or 6 scenarios and ask them the following questions. What should the most immediate response entail? What secondary responses need to happen? What resources will we need in order to respond? What challenges should we anticipate in responding? And how can this scenario inform future preventative efforts? So these are some questions that I think I like them because they kind of help participants get into an organizing mindset and help them think about, what resources they have at their disposal already and how you can make meaning of this experience, not only for you, but for the students and the other students who have seen it and reported it to you. This is another thing that is important to, I'm sure this is already obvious, but adults are usually the last people to hear about this stuff when it happens in schools, right? The kids already know about it. So the, thinking about how this scenario can be useful broadly to everyone involved going forward, I think is a really valuable question to ask. So the scenarios are, I often really try to use those as a way to foster engagement in these presentations. Okay, so this is where I'm going to step back from the toolkit presentation and just share with you a little bit about lessons learned. But before that, does anyone have any questions? I've been talking a lot, and if it's anything coming up for you that you have questions about, I'm happy to pause real quick. Yes, Kevin.
Thanks. This is amazing. I really, really like this toolkit. I'm just wondering, we've had some discussions about like who does the toolkit, or who did you imagine it targeting in school specifically? Is it, I'm a social studies teacher, and we've had the talk about like, is this just going to be put on social studies teachers, or is it for bigger, assemblies or small group assemblies? What was your thinking in terms of the target group at schools?
Yeah, so it's a little bit buried, and one of my goals with the next edition of the toolkit is to raise this aspect of it. But you'll see in the scenario sections that there are little subsections for staff members, administrators, I think parents, community members, and students. And so it's an excellent question. I think our target audience was really mostly teachers at first, because teachers were the folks who are reaching out to us. But kind of going back to that point of this is really everyone's job, we tried to include actionable material for people across the school, across the district, including students, right? And so this is another area where I think that there's so much more work to do. And we've talked a lot about how do we develop resources that can be useful to students who might be seeing this and not knowing what to do. And that's actually one of the things that, I'm very interested to see what materials you all produce. We're, always, the educators are very creative. So we've also had educators kind of create things on their own and then share them with us. And so that truly is an area where I think there's a lot of potential work to do. But it's really like for everybody, but realistically, it tends to be the school counselors and the social studies teachers and the ELA teachers who are kind of the early adopters, and then share it and try to get everyone else involved.
I have a question, if I can.
Yeah, please.
This is all very interesting, and I appreciate you reminding us that white supremacy is not just in certain groups and in mentalities and thinking, but we are actually breathing it, living it, and so on and so on. I think I appreciate this reminder of what is so-called post-colonialism, because it doesn't really exist. It is colonialism in effect still. The one question for me as a teacher who works with marginalized groups, the voiceless, quote unquote, how do you create this atmosphere, climate of safety in which scenarios such as the ones that you mentioned can be brought forward? I got students who are not willing to talk about this in small circles. Yeah. They'll talk to me about it because I know their families and we know we share commonalities and intersectionalities, but they're not going up and they're not going to open up in front of white folks. They're just not going to. So I want to take this toolkit. I want to add to it experiential and real life experiences, stories of those marginalized voices. But I'm gonna run into issues in which, first of all, are these voices going to be authentically represented? Whose stories are those? And second is, how do I bring forward the marginalization, the marginalized students, and actually get them talking, or have them be afraid and not be re-traumatized in some way or another, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. It's
Thank
a
you.
really, really important question, and I don't have a perfect answer for it. The two things that I will say is, one, I do think that creating some kind of anonymous reporting mechanism can be a way to help provide an opportunity for kids to share what they're experiencing without having to really expose themselves potentially to more danger, or to someone who is not going to validate them, or someone, a white educator who just, frankly, maybe they just don't feel very trusting of, and potentially for really good reason. So I think that's one potential way to address that, although it is certainly imperfect. Another is, I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of resources out there for bullying prevention. I do think that restorative justice can be a framework that can be really helpful and useful if it is implemented by people who are trained with this exact lens and scenario in mind. I think what happens sometimes is, and I don't want to disparage educators in any way, because I love educators, but I think sometimes what happens is people get like a little bit of education about restorative justice, and they're like, great, we'll just like get all the kids in the room who were involved, and we'll just like talk it out, right? And that can be a disaster. And it can really, like you said, sort of re-traumatize. So I think effective, robust, sustained restorative justice that is supported by ongoing training and support can be one way to help students feel more comfortable talking about things that may have happened to them. But with the caveat that many schools are not doing that very effectively. So that's, again, an imperfect answer. I think this also just really goes to the importance of representation within education, and having a diverse teaching force and school administration makes a huge difference to kids who are not part of the dominant identity. So again, yes, a very imperfect answer, but that's kind of, that's what I would say. Mary Ann.
Hi there.
Hi.
Glad the jackhammering here has stopped so I can be on my Zoom on the laptop again. I really appreciate the way you framed this, starting off by saying this is mainstream and framing it as democracy and community building. That really resonates with me, and I guess the idea of we need to be building the skills in youth that we want them to have, not kind of fighting against the things that we don't want them to do. And that's kind of maybe a community development frame. So that said, I'm wondering if you can describe some of the skills that you are building in the youth who are in schools that have this. And I guess the other thing is, we've talked a lot about school culture and building a school culture. So I'm really interested in, I think, some of the things you talked about in terms of really emphasizing the values, speak to building a school culture. So maybe focus more on the skills question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the things that I think is really important to help young people being able to identify is the dynamics of scapegoating and backlash. And so, for example, if you look at social movements throughout history and the successes that they achieve, you will see very shortly after that some response to those successes in an attempt to scale back those gains, right? And that being sort of mindful of that, for example, in social studies and history instruction, being mindful of that pattern in history and helping students see that is, I think, a very useful skill to have, because then you can say, you can sort of point out like, oh, we see in communities that have welcomed a lot of refugees, and then a year or two later, you see a lot of anti-refugee sentiment start to boil up in these communities, even though there's really no credence to the complaints that they're leveraging in terms of the impact of the community growing and changing in this way. And so, helping students really learn to analyze data, for example, around things like Maria Hinojosa did an awesome lesson series, which I'll find and I will send to Linda. I think it was called Immigration by the Numbers, and it looked at, it essentially was like a data analysis lesson set that helped young people really see, like, here's what people are saying are the effects, the economic effects of immigration in their communities, and here is the reality. And so then, you can analyze that data. So that's just one example. I think scapegoating is another really important thing to help students be aware of, because it is so central to so many of the narratives and misconceptions and conspiracy theories that are flying around. And students, they may very well have, they're developing their sense of justice, right? They're developing their sense of kind of, who am I in the world, and what do I stand for, and who are my people? And so this is an opportunity to really help them kind of think about how that could be exploited by someone who wanted you to believe what they believe and do what they're telling you to do politically, right? So those are just two examples. But I think in general, digital literacy is huge, helping kids really understand the sources that they're reading and how to identify a source that's based in, it's more credible and that's based in sound research versus, and that's a very difficult thing to do. I don't know if you've ever taken one of those, is this a real source or is this a fake news thing tests online, but I consistently fail them. It's very difficult, but it's something that's really just even being aware that fake news is a thing and that there are things that you can do to learn how to spot it. Super important. So those are just a couple of examples, but yeah, I'm guessing that the social studies folks and the librarians in the group probably have some really good ideas about that too. Gareth.
Thank you, Adrian. It's one of the things that stands out for me is the reference to culture and repeatedly reminding students about the importance of diversity and inclusion and those kinds of things, but that your toolkit understands those as important underpinnings, cultural underpinnings, but that your toolkit is more focused. So it's not like it ignores those things, but it doesn't duplicate. So I appreciate that part, but I actually came with a question. So the Daily Stormer is quoted as saying that the Daily Stormer website is mainly designed to target children. And the age that Andrew Anglin speaks to is from age 11 and on. So my question is, and you may be getting, I don't think you finished your presentation, but I'd be interested, we've had some conversation about at what age we should begin focusing our work and whether early years should be part of that. 11 is right on the borderline between our Manitoba's distinction between early years and middle school. So if you're getting to that anyway, just ignore my question for now. But that would be something I'd be interested in hearing more about.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you asked that, because I don't have any information about that in this presentation. I think that I don't think that middle school is too early to start talking about this. I think that you can start talking about fairness and kindness and friendship in preschool, right? I don't see any reason why, and there's a great set of standards that I'll share as well, called the social justice standards that Learning for Justice has created, that does go all the way K through 12. And it doesn't necessarily talk specifically about this kind of organizing, right? So this, you're right, this is distinct, and that's actually the next thing that I'm going to talk about. But I think it's okay to, and important to, you know, when we're, and you know, this is a huge debate in the US right now, is well, we don't want to teach about like our racist history because we don't want to traumatize young kids or somehow give them ideas that they wouldn't have otherwise. And I guess my feeling is, if young people are spending time alone with other young people, if they are spending time online, if they are playing video games, they're starting to hear some of these messages, and it's not talking about it is really doing them a disservice, because you're kind of leaving them out to dry with no framework or context or information about how to interpret what they're hearing, right? So, I mean, I'm not a parent, so I'm just guessing, but I think 11-year-olds play video games, right? I mean, I think so. So I think if that to me, that when you're really starting to not have the same amount of you know, familial or parental oversight, and of course that's different in every family, is, you know, it should probably be happening before that. That's my feeling. This is something that we've targeted the toolkit for high school, but I think that, like I said, when we did the trainings, we had kindergarten teachers, we had elementary level folks who were really skillfully able to weave this work in, if for no other reason that they felt that teachers needed to understand and be able to recognize this rhetoric if they saw it. Or, for example, you know, because kids could be repeating things that they're hearing at home from their parents, and bringing that to school and bringing that into conversations with other kids that, you know, are obviously really harmful. So that's like a total meandering non-answer, but I don't think 11 is too young, is the quick and dirty version. Okay, I'm just gonna check time here. So actually your question leads perfectly into what I was going to say. So one question that comes up a lot when we do these presentations is, how does this fit into anti-bias or anti-racist education more broadly, right? And sometimes there's kind of a resistance to this work because people see it as a distraction. They think that this is, you know, this is just something that's sort of a problem in other places, and it's not a problem here, and it's an attempt to distract us from the realities of you know, our efforts to divest from white supremacy, which I think is an important thing to talk about. So the way that we often will do that is when we're digging into this issue with people, is to really ask them to think like, well, what made you decide to get into anti-bias, anti-racist education work? And how did you know that you were the right person in the school to do this work? And what do you think the relationship is? And what do you think our obligation to our students are if, you know, if they're hearing this kind of stuff and we're not equipped to deal with it? So I think if you are experiencing resistance, just opening a line of dialogue about these questions, I think can be really helpful. So this is a form of anti-racist work. It doesn't look like what anti-racism work often does look like in a school setting. in part because its primary function is not necessarily about individual relationships or teaching individual students to address their individual biases, right? This is about fighting a social movement. This is about equipping the institution to prepare young people broadly to think in such a way that makes them less susceptible to this kind of organizing. So all of it is important. There's not a need to create a hierarchy or feel competitive. These things are very much integrated. We talk a lot about white nationalism, or excuse me, white supremacy being the soil from which white nationalism grows, right? So these are both really important things. Are you the right person to do this work? Again, that this is needs to be an individual choice, but our belief is that if we can build coalitions, we can build bridges, we can really get everyone on the same page about this, then we stand a much better chance of being effective, because it is a white nationalist tactic to take up a lot of space and make a lot of noise. And so if we're not taking up space and we're not making noise, then we're essentially ceding the airtime to people who are saying incredibly harmful and divisive things. So that's another rationale that I will sometimes use. I'm going to keep going, but I will send you these slides as well. So another thing is, and I've mentioned this before, is that we really encourage a pro-democracy framework that focuses on strengthening the institutions and try to minimize the way that we talk about, that we don't use a countering violent extremism set of narratives. And there is a whole like FBI program for schools based in a countering violent extremism framework that Western State Center does not recommend, and in large part because it tends to increase surveillance. It tends to be overly reliant on law enforcement. It tends to, in fact, make vulnerable communities that are already very vulnerable, specifically immigrant communities, Muslim communities, the data around how this kinds of programs have been used generally have been harmful to people of color, and can also put progressive and left-leaning organizations in the crosshairs as well. So so we tend to avoid using that kind of framework and that kind of language. And again, I've said this before, but really leading with values. I probably don't need to belabor this point anymore, but it's something that I think is very, very important. And then this is something that, is not consistently available to everyone, unfortunately. And a lot of the educators that we work with really are kind of like the lone person in their school who cares about these issues. And I have tremendous sympathy for that. It is the case that if you have an administration that actively and vocally supports its teachers, and teachers who belong to either teachers unions or strong coalitions of folks who are doing this work together, really are going to be in the best position to push back against this kind of organizing. It's much less likely that a school is going to be targeted if the school, the parents, the administrators, the community is presenting a united front and saying, like, we absolutely are not going to tolerate this in our school. Then that's these are skilled organizers, right? White nationalists actually are very savvy, and they know when this is not a fight that's going to be advantageous to them, and they will take it elsewhere. This also sort of taps into something that I wanted to mention that we don't often talk about in the presentation, but I think is really worth knowing, which is that there's often an effort made to make it seem like for example, if a group is attacking a school and they're saying, they're teaching our kids to be gay, they're, we're trying to get teachers fired, etc. They're, you hear the language of anti-CRT, cultural critical race theory organizing a lot in the US right now in particular. it is often the case that those attacks are being initiated at a national level, but are being orchestrated in such a way that they appear to be local, that they appear to be coming from the grassroots level. And in many, many, many cases, that is not the case. So, and we know this because we see it, schools where folks they're like, oh, well, we're not going to touch that. We're not going to go there because we're not going to win, right? So there's a cherry picking targeting thing happening here, where because and in many cases these parent groups are not white nationalists. I want to make that clear, but there is a similar strain of an effort to destabilize the institution, right? And so there's some shared playbooks happening, I guess is what I would say. And one of the playbooks is make it seem like this is really coming from like your local concerned mom and pop. And that is often not the case. This is so difficult. Somebody raised this point earlier about not allowing the opposition to frame the argument, but and I mentioned earlier that it is a tactic for these groups to be in attack mode. So then, putting you in a position of saying like, oh, well, I only have the best interest of children at heart, and I would never do this. And, I'm not. So anything that you can do to practice how to avoid getting into a bad faith argument. And this is really, kind of in the scenario of like a parent attacking you, or a parent group attacking the school, et cetera. Or even if you're in a dialogue with a student who's espousing some white nationalist rhetoric, just avoid the responding point by point to what they're saying, because then you're essentially allowing the other person to frame the debate. This comes up a lot in this movement that we're seeing, particularly in places like Florida and Texas, where now there is this idea that we have to teach every side of every historical event that has ever happened. But of course, it's not every historical event that has ever happened. It's things like the Holocaust, right? And trying to create a world in which it is legitimate to teach Holocaust denial in public school. And this is something that is extremely difficult it's a hard bell to unring once that rhetoric starts to fly. And so being really proactive about saying like, we don't have to give airtime to bad faith arguments. You don't have to. This is your school, this is your classroom, is another way to kind of head that off at the pass. So this is another toolkit that I shared with Linda and Kaiser, but I will make sure that you all get it as well. This is specifically for parents and caregivers who might be experiencing some of this rhetoric at home. So I just wanted to mention that as well. It's not like a direct accompaniment to the toolkit, but it actually augments some of the material that's in the toolkit and provides some nice background. Yeah, and then so the last thing I'll say is that we do have a Facebook group for people who are using the toolkit and interested in connecting with other educators. I definitely understand the irony of hosting this group on Facebook, but that's just where we are. If you'd like to join, this is the URL, and I'm more than happy to, I can put this in the chat. Oh, no, I can't. I'll make sure that you get it as well. So I'm going to stop there. I know that I maybe have gone over a little bit. Hopefully still have enough time for questions.